by the time he was 33 years old, Hugh Morris was already acknowledged as the most dexterous and daring surgeon in England. And both in his private practice and in his voluntary work at one of the great London hospitals, his record of success as an operator was unparalleled among his colleagues. Now, this success was, I think, based to a great extent upon a singular self-confidence and on a set of strongly held personal beliefs, among them that vivisection was the most fruitful means of progress in the science of surgery. Now, rightly or wrongly, Morris held that he was justified in causing suffering to animals, while of course sparing them all possible pain, if he thereby could reasonably hope to gain fresh knowledge about similar operations on human beings which might save life or mitigate suffering. Now, I make no judgment, but the motive was honest, I think, and the gain was already immense. Now, it should be added that Dr. Morris had nothing but scorn for those who, for their own amusement, took out packs of hounds to run foxes to death, or match two greyhounds to see which would give the death grip to a single terrified hare the first. To him, that was wanton torture and utterly unjustifiable. Year in, year out, Morris worked incessantly, never taking a holiday, and for the most part, when the day's work was over, he was to be found in his study poring over texts. One warm October night, however, during a moment of rare leisure, he and his friend Jack Madden were dining together at his house overlooking Regent's Park. Now, the windows of his drawing room were open, and the two men sat smoking after dinner on the broad window seat. Madden was starting the next day for Egypt, where he was engaged in archaeological work, and he'd been vainly trying to persuade Morris to join him for a month or two up the Nile. He was going to be engaged throughout the winter, he explained, in the excavation of a newly discovered cemetery across the river from Luxor, and he thought that the climate and change of scene would provide a much-needed tonic for his friend. But it was no good. No, said Morris. When my eye begins to fail and my fingers start to falter, that's when I think of taking my ease. But what do I want a holiday now for? I'd be pining to get back to work the moment I set off. I like work, you see, Jack. No, I do. I genuinely like it. I much prefer it to loafing. Pure selfishness, I suppose. Well, be unselfish for once then, damn it, said Madden. Besides, your work would benefit too, wouldn't it? I mean, it can't be good for a man never to relax. Surely freshness must count for something in the operating theatre. No, precious little, actually, if you're as strong as I am. No, I'm sorry, I'm a believer in continual concentration and focus if one wants to make progress in anything. But, I mean, don't you get tired? Of course I get tired sometimes. Everybody does. But, I'm never tired when I'm operating, you see. And that's what matters. And after all, time's so damned short, isn't it? I mean, 20 years from now I'll be past my best and I'll take my holiday then. And then when my holiday's over, I'll fold my hands and go to sleep forever. Yeah, thank God I've no fear that there's an afterlife. The spark of vitality that has animated us burns low and then goes out like a candle. And as for my body, what do I care what happens to that when I'm done with it? I mean, nothing will survive of me except some small contribution I may have made to surgery, and in a few years' time that'll be superseded. But for that I perish utterly. Well, Madden squirted some soda into a glass. Well, if you've quite settled that then, I suppose. No, look, I haven't settled it, Jack. Science has settled it. All right, the body is transmuted into other forms. I don't deny that. Worms batten on it, helps to feed the grass, and then some animal consumes the grass. But as for the survival of the spirit or the soul or whatever you want to call it, I mean, you show me one tittle of scientific evidence to support the idea. Huh? No, I thought not. Besides, if it did survive, then all the evil and malice in it would survive too, wouldn't it? I mean, why should the death of the body purge all that away? No, I mean, it's a nightmare to contemplate such a thing. And yet the spiritualists and their friends want to persuade us that the nightmare is true for our own consolation. God. Or those old Egyptian friends of yours, eh? They all thought there was something sacred about their bodies, didn't they, after they were quit of them, covered their coffins with curses and the such like. Oh, constantly, said Madden. Yeah, it's the general rule, in fact. Narrowy curses written in hieroglyphics on the mummy case, or, as you say, carved onto the sarcophagus. Right. And that's not going to deter you for a moment this winter from opening up as many tombs as you can find and rifling the many objects of interest or value. All right, no, it isn't, said Madden. I will. I'll remove all the objects of archaeological interest and I'll unwind the mummies to find their scarabs and jewellery. But Hugh, I make it an absolute rule always to rebury those bodies. Yeah? Now, I'm absolutely strict about that. I mean, I don't say I believe in the power of those curses, but, well, I've always thought there's something indecent about a mummy in a museum. All right, said Morris. Right, but what if you found some mummified body with an interesting malformation, say? I mean, you'd send it to some anatomical institute, wouldn't you? You'd investigate. Well, I mean, it's yet to happen, but no, I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't. What? Well, then you're a superstitious goth and an anti-educational vandal, and I want nothing... Well, hang on. What's that? Morris looked out of the window as he spoke. The light from the room vividly illuminated the square of lawn outside, and across it was crawling the small twitching shape of an animal. Well, Morris vaulted out of the window and returned a few moments later carrying a little grey monkey, evidently very badly injured. He ran his fingers over the stiff, outstretched legs. Paralysis of the lower limbs, he said after a moment. Looks like some lesion of the spine. He's not going to be running anywhere anytime soon, poor beggar. The monkey lay still, looking up at him with wide, anguished eyes as he continued his examination. Yeah, I thought so. Fracture of one of the lumbar vertebrae. Well, lucky for me, if not for him. It's a rare injury, this, but you see, I've often wondered. I mean, if he was a man, if he was a patient of mine, I shouldn't dare take the risk, of course, but, well, as it's only a monkey. Well, dinner was clearly over for the night, and soon afterwards Jack Madden bid his farewells. The next day he started on his southward journey, and by the middle of November he was at work on the newly discovered cemetery. He and another Englishman were in charge of the excavation, and to avoid the daily ferrying across the Nile from Luxor, he hired a native house in the adjoining village of Gurna. A reef of low sandstone cliff ran northwards from here towards the temple and terraces of Deir el-Bahari, and it was in the face of this that the ancient graveyard lay. Now, many of the more important sepulchres, as they'd expected, had been rifled in ancient times. The slabs forming the entrances into them had been split open and the mummies unwound. But every now and then, Madden did unearth a tomb that had escaped the ancient marauders, and in one of these he found the sarcophagus of a priest of the 19th dynasty, which alone repaid the preceding week of fruitless work. It was, in fact, a really quite spectacular haul. There were nearly 100 Ushabti figures made of the very finest blue glaze, 4 fine alabaster vessels in which the viscera of the dead man had been placed before embalming, and a table with legs of carved ivory and ebony, the top inlaid with squares of coloured glass. The priest's sandals had survived and were adorned with exquisite silver filigree, and his staff of office, which was inlaid with cornelian and gold, on the head of which was a figure of a squatting cat carved in amethyst. Now, the money itself, when unwound, was found to be decked with a necklace of gold plaques and onyx beads. All of these, of course, were sent down to the museum at Cairo, and Madden obediently reinterred the mummy at the foot of the cliff before the tomb. He wrote to Hugh Morris describing the find, laying stress on the unbroken splendour of the crystalline winter days and the cool nights when the stars rose and set on the vaporless rim of the desert. If by chance he would change his mind about a holiday, well, there's ample room for him at his house in Gurna. He knew how welcome he would be. A fortnight later, Madden received an unexpected reply from his friend. He'd been unwell, he explained, and was starting at once by sea to Port Said. In due course he announced his arrival at Cairo, and Madden went across the river to meet him. He'd been frankly rather worried after receiving the letter, but he was reassured to find Morris as vital and active as ever, the picture of bronzed good health. Now, the two were alone that night because Madden's colleague had gone for a week's trip up the Nile, and they sat out when dinner was over in the enclosed courtyard adjoining the house. Until then, Morris had shied on the subject of his health, but he now spoke up. "I may as well tell you what's been amiss, Jack," he said. "I mean, I know I look a fearful fraud as an invalid, and it's true that physically I've never been in better shape. Every organ functioning perfectly, except one. Yeah. It was like this, you see. After you left, I went on as usual for another month or so, very busy, very serene, and yeah, very successful. And then one morning I arrived at the hospital where there was a perfectly ordinary but major operation waiting for me. Now the patient, who was a middle-aged man, he was wheeled into the theatre, anaesthetised, and I was just about to make the first incision into his abdomen when I saw that sitting on his chest was a little grey monkey. I mean, it wasn't looking at me, it was looking at a fold of skin that I held between my thumb and finger. Well, I mean, I knew, of course, that there was no monkey there, that what I saw was a hallucination. And I think you'll agree that there's nothing much wrong with my nerves when I tell you that I went through the operation with clear eyes and an unshaking hand. I had to, didn't I? No choice in the matter. I couldn't very well say, "Nurse, please take that monkey away," because I knew there was no monkey to take away. And I couldn't say, "Somebody else must do this. I have a distressing hallucination that there's a monkey sitting on the patient's chest." That would have been the end of my career as a surgeon. But you see, all the time I was at work, it sat there. And for the most part, it seemed absorbed in what I was doing, peering into the wound. But every now and then it looked up at me and it would kind of chatter with rage. Once it fingered a spring forceps which clipped a severed vein, and that was the worst moment of all. But at the end, it was carried out still balancing on the man's chest. "Oh, thank you, I will, if you don't mind." Well, I mean, as you can imagine, it was an absolutely beastly experience, and I went straight away from the hospital to consult my old friend Robert Angus, the nerve specialist, and I told him exactly what had happened. Well, he did various tests. He examined my eyes, tested my reflexes, took my blood pressure and so on, and there was nothing wrong with any of them. And then he asked me general questions about my health and lifestyle, and among these questions was one which I'm sure has already occurred to you, namely, had anything occurred to me lately which was likely to make me visualise a monkey? Well, I told him that yes, a few weeks ago a monkey with a broken lumbar vertebra had crawled onto my lawn, and that I had attempted an operation binding the broken vertebra with wire, which had occurred to me before as a possibility on humans. I mean, you remember the night yourself, no doubt. "Yes, of course," said Madden. It was the night before I set off here. What happened to the monkey, by the way?" "Oh, it died." No, well, I was pleased because I'd expected it would die under the anaesthetic, but in fact it lived for 2 or 3 more days. Anyway, when Angus had asked all his questions, he gave me a good wigging, a bit like you tried to do that night, but only firmer. He said that I'd persistently overtaxed my brain for years without giving it a rest or any change of occupation, and that if I wanted to be of any further use in the world, I must drop my work at once for a couple of months. Told me that my brain was tired out, that I'd persisted in stimulating it. A man like me, he said, was no better than a confirmed drunkard, and that as a warning I had a touch of appropriate delirium tremens. The cure was to drop work just as a drunkard might drop drink. He laid it on pretty hot, actually, and said I was on the verge of a breakdown, entirely owing to my own foolishness, but I had wonderful physical health, and that if I did break down, I would be a disgrace. And above all, and I must say that this seemed to me rather good advice, he told me not to attempt to avoid thinking about what had happened. If I kept my mind off it, he said, I should be perhaps driving it into the subconscious, and then there would be real trouble. Rub it in, he said. Think what a fool you've been. Face it, dwell on it. Make yourself thoroughly ashamed of yourself. And monkeys, don't avoid the thought of monkeys, he said. In fact, he recommended that I go straight away to the zoological gardens and spend an hour in the monkey house. What odd treatment, said Madden. It's brilliant treatment. My brain, you see, he explained, had rebelled against its slavery and had hoisted a red flag with the device of a monkey on it. I must show that I wasn't frightened, I must retort on it by making myself look at dozens of real monkeys which could bite and maul and savage me instead of one little sham monkey that had no existence at all. And at the same time, he insisted that I had to take this red flag seriously, recognise that there was real danger. Above all, he said I must rest, and he promised me that no bogus monkeys would ever trouble me again. Are there any real ones in Egypt, by the way? Monkeys, I mean. Good question, said Madden. Oh, I don't think there are. But there must have been once, because there are images of them all over the tombs and temples. Well, that's good. We'll keep the memory green and my brain cool. Well, anyway, that's my story. What do you make of it? It's absolutely terrifying, said Madden. But you must have got nerves of iron to go through that operation with the monkey watching. Okay. It was hellish, my friend. Absolutely hellish, believe me. Out of some disordered slime in my brain had crawled this unbidden thing which showed itself apparently substantial to my eyes. And it didn't come from outside. My eyes hadn't told me that my brain that was a monkey sitting on the man's chest. My brain had told my eyes and was making fools of them. I felt as if someone I absolutely trusted had played me false. I wondered, of course, too, whether, I don't know, some instinct in my subconscious wasn't revolting against the work that I do on animals, the vivisection. Oh, of course, yeah, my reason assures me that it is entirely justified, absolutely. But you see, what if my subconscious persuaded my brain to give me a good fright and reproduce before my eyes the semblance of a monkey just when I was putting into practice what I'd learned from dealing out pain and death to animals? Anyway, he got up suddenly. What about bed? 5 hours sleep was enough for me when I was at work, but now I believe that I could sleep the whole clock round. Well, young Wilson, who was Madden's archaeological colleague, returned the next day, and the work went steadily on along the sandstone ridge. Every so often there'd appear a chiselled smoothness in the cliff, and there was great excitement to see if, when they exposed the hewn slab that formed the door of the tomb, it had escaped the ancient marauders. But for many days now they'd come upon nothing that hadn't already been opened. The mummies had all been unwound in the search for necklaces and scarabs, and their bones lay scattered about. Madden was always at pains to reinter these. Now, at first, Hugh Morris was assiduous in watching the excavations, but as day after day went by without anything of interest turning up, his attendance grew less frequent. He visited the Tomb of Kings, and he went across the river and saw the temples at Karnak, but his appetite for antiquities was small. On other days he rode into the desert or spent the day with friends at one of the Luxor hotels. He came home from there one evening in very good spirits because he'd played tennis with a woman on whom he'd operated for a malignant tumour 6 months before, and she'd skipped about the court like a 12-year-old girl. But he was growing restless. God, how I long to be at work again, he said one morning. I wonder if I oughtn't to have stuck it out and defied my brain to frighten me. Well, the weeks went by, and now there were but 2 days left before Morris returned to England and his much-missed operating theatre. As he sat over breakfast that morning with Wilson, a workman from the excavation came by with a note from Madden. It was evidently written in some haste, and it announced that they'd just come upon a tomb which seemed to be unrifled because the slab that closed it was in place and unbroken. Now, to Wilson, the news was like the sight of a sail to a shipwrecked mariner, and when, after a quarter of an hour, Morris followed him, he was just in time to see the slab prized away. There was no sarcophagus inside, for the rock walls did the duty for that. But lying there, quite intact, and varnished and bright as if painted yesterday, was a mummy case, roughly following the outline of a human form. By it stood alabaster vases containing the entrails of the dead, and at each corner of the sepulchre there was, carved out of the sandstone rock and forming, as it were, pillars to support the roof, thick-set images of squatting apes. Well, the mummy case was hoisted carefully out and carried by the workmen into the courtyard of the excavator's house at Gurner, and after dinner that evening the men got to work. The face painted on the lid of the case was that of a young woman, and Madden quickly identified her from the inscription as Apenara, daughter of the overseer of the cattle of Senmut. And there's the usual formulas, he said as he studied the hieroglyphics. And, Hugh, now look, you'll be interested in this. You asked me about this once. Listen. Apenara curses anyone who meddles with her bones. Should anyone do so, the guardians of her sepulchre will see to him. Oh, crikey, it's pretty vivid stuff, actually. They will tear the hair from his head and scoop his eyes from their sockets and pluck the thumb from his right hand as a man plucks the young blade of corn from its sheath. Well, Morris laughed as well. Very pretty little attentions, he said. And who are these guardians of this sweet young lady's sepulchre? Well, those ugly great apes, I suppose, but we shan't trouble them. Tomorrow I'll bury Miss Apenara again with all decency in the trench at the foot of her tomb. Well, it was dark by now, and Wilson fetched a paraffin lamp. The lid of the mummy case was easily detached, and within was the slim, swaddled body. The embalmer had not done his job very well, because the skin and flesh had entirely perished from the head, leaving only bones of the skull stained brown with bitumen. Round it was a mop of hair, which with the ingress of air subsided like a belated souffle and crumbled into dust. The cloth that swathed the body was just as brittle, but around the neck, still just holding together, was a collar of curious and rare workmanship. Little ivory figures of squatting apes alternated with silver beads, but again a touch broke the thread that strung them together, and these had to be picked out singly. A bracelet of scarabs and cornelians still clasped one of the fleshless wrists, and then they turned the body over in order to get at the members of the necklace which lay beneath the nape. The rotted mummy cloth fell away altogether from the back, disclosing the shoulder blades and the spine down as far as the pelvis. Now here the embalming had been much more successful, because the bones still held together with remnants of muscle and cartilage. Hugh Morris suddenly sprang to his feet. "Good God! What is it?" said Madden. "My God, look! Look there! What? One of the lumbar vertebrae. Look there at the base of the spine. It's been broken and clamped together with a metal band. Good God, to hell with your apes and scarabs, Jack. Let me come and examine something much more modern than any of us." He pushed Jack Madden aside and peered at this marvel of surgery. Put the lamp closer, he said, as if directing some nurse at an operation. "Now that's absolutely extraordinary. Look, that vertebra has been broken right across and then clamped back together again. I mean, no one, as far as I know, has ever attempted anything like it. I mean, except me on that paralysed little monkey that crept into my garden that night, and that was hardly a success. But here, some Egyptian surgeon more than, 3,000 years ago, performing on a young girl, and look, she lived. She lived, Jack. Look at that bony substance over the metal band. Now that's a slow process. That doesn't happen overnight. She lived, damn it. God, she probably recovered completely, and my wretched little monkey only survived for 2 days, and he was in agony the entire time. Well, the questing fingers of the surgeon perceived more finely than actual sight, and now he closed his eyes as the tip of them felt their way about the broken vertebra and the clamping metal band. Now The band doesn't even encircle the bone, he said, and there are no studs attaching it. God, there must have been a spring. It's been clamped round the bone itself. God, the surgeon must have scraped the vertebra clean of flesh before he attached it. God, I'd give 2 years of my life to have watched that happening, and it was worthwhile giving up 2 months of my work to have seen the result. My God, Jack, so my holiday has not been a waste of time after all. Thank you, old man. Thank you for inviting me here. Well, Madden settled that it was not worthwhile to send the mummy case to the museum at Giza, for it was only a very ordinary type, and when the examination was over, they lifted the body back into it for re-internment the next day. It was now long after midnight, and presently the house was dark. Hugh Morris slept on the ground floor in a room adjoining the yard where the mummy case lay, and he remained long awake that night, marvelling at the astonishing piece of surgical skill performed, according to Madden, some 35 centuries ago. I mean, so occupied had been his mind with homage that not until now did he realise that the tangible proof and witness of the operation would be tomorrow buried again and lost to science. Well, I mean, that was unthinkable, of course. No, he must persuade Madden to let him detach at least 3 of the vertebrae, the mended one and those immediately above and below it, and take them back to England as demonstration of what could be done. He'd lecture it to the Royal College of Surgeons. Other trained eyes besides his own must see what had been achieved by some unknown operator in the 19th dynasty. But supposing Madden refused? I mean, didn't he always make a point of scrupulously reburying these remains? He did. He'd said so with some pride. Yeah, he was. He was a kind of a principle with him, and no doubt some superstitious complex was also involved, which was even harder to combat because of its sheer unreasonableness. Well, no, he couldn't risk the chance of a refusal. He got out of bed, listened for a moment by his door, and then he slipped softly into the yard. The moon had risen and he had no need for a lamp. He drew the lid of the coffin and folded back the tattered cerements which Madden had replaced over the body. He thought that the lower vertebrae would be easily detached, so far perished were the muscle and cartilage which held them together, but they stuck together as if they'd been clamped, and it required the utmost force to snap the spine. As he did so, the severed bones cracked with a noise like a pistol shot. But no, there was no sign that anyone in the house had heard him, no sign of steps or lights at the window. One more fracture was needed, and then the relic was his. Now, before he replaced the ragged cloths, he took one last look at the stained and fleshless bones. Shadows dwelt in the empty eye sockets, and it looked momentarily as if black sunken eyes still lay there regarding him. He shuddered slightly, and replacing the lid, he went back to his room. Well, the mummy case was reinterred the next day, and 2 evenings after that, Morris left Luxor by the night train for Cairo to join a homeward-bound P&O at Port Said. There were a few hours to spare before his ship sailed, and having deposited his luggage, which included a locked leather dispatch case, on board, he lunched at the Café Tufik near the quay. There was a pretty garden in front, separated from the street by a low wooden rail, and at this Morris sat and ate as he watched the polychromatic pageant of Eastern life passing him by. The Egyptian officials in their broadcloth frock coats and red fezzes, barefooted fellaheen in blue gabardines, a half-naked gutter snipe with a sprig of scarlet hibiscus behind his ear, dishevelled sons of the prophet in green turbans, and painted ladies with lace-rimmed parasols and provocative glances. A Greek bootblack tapped his brushes on his box to attract customers, and an Egyptian girl squatted in the gutter beside a gramophone. The steamers passing into the canal hooted on their sirens. And then at the edge of the pavement there sauntered by a young Italian lad, harnessed to a barrel organ. With one hand he ground out a popular air by Verdi. In the other he held out a tin can while a small monkey in a yellow jacket tethered to his wrist sat on top of the instrument. Morris enjoyed the gay, tinkling tune, and feeling in his pocket for some change, he beckoned the Italian as he passed. The boy smiled broadly and stepped up to the rail, and suddenly the monkey leapt from its place on the organ and sprang onto the table where Morris sat. It landed, chattering with rage, in a crash of broken glass, and Morris's coffee cup slopped its contents over the tablecloth. Next moment, the Italian had twitched the frenzied little beast back to him, and it fell head downwards on the pavement. Now the waiter at Morris's table hurried up with voluble execrations, and a passing policeman kicked out at the monkey as it lay on the ground, while the barrel organ itself tottered and crashed onto the roadway, and then all subsided again, and the Italian boy picked up the body of his little mascot from the pavement. He held it out in his hands to Morris. "È morto," he said. "Well, it bloody well serves it right too," said Morris. "What the hell did he fly at me like that for?" Well, he travelled back to London by long sea, and day after day during those hours on shipboard, that tragic little incident in which he played no responsible part began to make a sort of colouring matter in his mind. It was sometimes, if the shadow of a passing seagull slid across the deck, there leapt into his brain the ludicrous fancy that a monkey was springing at him. One day they ran into a gale, and when, with a sudden lurch of the ship, a steward upset a glass at his elbow, Morris jumped from his seat, thinking that a monkey had leapt onto his table. There was a cinematograph show in the saloon one evening in which some naturalist exhibited the films he'd taken of wildlife in Indian jungles, and when a company of monkeys appeared on the screen, swinging their way through the trees, Morris clutched the sides of his chairs in panic. When he came into his cabin late one night and saw a creature crouching by his dispatch case, his breath caught in his throat before he realised that it was just the ship's cat, which rose with gleaming eyes and arched its back. Now, these alarms, he could not deny, were disquieting, and although he had had as yet no repetition of the monkey hallucination, he felt sure that some deep-buried idea, to cure which he'd taken 2 months' holiday, was still unpurged from his mind. He determined that he would consult Robert Angus again as soon as he got home and seek further advice. I mean, probably the silly incident at Port Said had rekindled this obscure trouble. But there was now this added to it, that he knew now that he was afraid of real monkeys. There was real terror sprouting in the dark of his soul. Well, it felt good to be back in England. For the last 3 days of the voyage, no menace had flashed out on him from the unknown dusks, and he was confident that he had been disquieting himself in vain. There was a light mist lying over Regent's Park on this warm March evening, and a drizzle of rain was falling. He made an appointment the next morning with the specialist, and then he telephoned to the hospital that he had returned and hoped to resume work at once. He dined in good spirits, talking to his manservant, and, as subsequently came out, he showed him his treasured bones, telling him that he'd taken the relic from a mummy which he'd seen unwrapped, and that he meant to lecture on it. When he went up to bed that night, he carried his leather dispatch case with him. The bed was comfortable after the ship's berth, and through his open window came the soft hissing of the rain on the shrubs outside. Morris's servant slept in the room immediately over his, and a little before dawn he woke with a start, roused by horrible cries from somewhere close at hand. And then came words. Screams for help and mercy, yelled out in a voice that he knew very well. The man hurried down and clicked on the light in his master's room as he entered. The cries had ceased, and now only a low moaning could be heard from the bed. A huge ape with busy hands was bending over it. Then, taking up the body that lay there by the neck and the hips, it bent it backwards, and it cracked like a dry stick. Then it tore open the leather case that lay on the table by the bedside, and with something that gleamed white in its dripping fingers, it shambled to the window and disappeared. A doctor arrived within half an hour, but he was too late, of course. Handfuls of hair, with flaps of skin attached, had been torn from the head of the murdered man. Both eyes were scooped from their sockets. The right thumb had been plucked off the hand, and the back was broken across the lower vertebrae. Now, nothing has since come to light which could rationally explain this tragedy. No large ape had escaped from Regent's Park Zoo, or as far as could be ascertained from anywhere else, nor was the monstrous visitor of that night ever seen again. Morris's servant only had the briefest sight of it, and his description of it at the inquest did not tally with that of any known simian type. And the sequel was, if anything, even more mysterious. Jack Madden, returning to England at the close of the season in Egypt, had asked Morris's servant exactly what it was that his master had shown him that fateful evening, as having been taken from him from a mummy which he'd seen unwrapped, and the servant had given him a sufficiently conclusive account of it. Next autumn, Madden continued his excavations in the cemetery at Gurna, and he once more disinterred the mummy case of Apanara and opened it up. The spinal vertebrae were all in place and complete, and one had round it the silver clip which his dead friend had hailed as a unique achievement in surgery.